First, I'd like to thank the organisers very much for this invitation to talk to you today. It's my great regret that I can't be with you, but at least technology brings us the opportunity to be able to get together, even if only virtually. And my title for today is The Effective Use of Technologies in Teaching and Learning in Higher and Further Education. And when we're talking about technology, I think it's always valuable to think in terms of the context within which we're thinking. And the context for this, I think, has to be the global demand for education. And when we look at what that means, the new UNESCO goals for education, for example, if you remember, the Millennium Goals for education were education for all, every child having access to primary education in the world. Now, that was meant to be achieved by 2015, which is next year, and we're not going to make it. And yet, the new UNESCO goals for education for the next 15 years are every child completes a full 9 years of free basic education. And not only that, beyond basic education, that has to be expanded to meet the needs for knowledge and skills. Now, that's an incredible demand on our education processes. And when you think of what that means for higher education and lifelong learning, it's going to imply significant growth in graduate teachers to be able to supply this level of education. However, in our current model of higher education, at least in very many countries where higher education is in high demand, the model is currently around 1 to 25 staff to students, and that ratio will never meet that total world demand for higher education, which is currently running at something like 100 million a year, people wanting higher education. And that can only increase over the next few years. So we have a big problem. But fortunately, we have new digital technologies. And there is some hope that if we use it cleverly and we use it wisely, we'll be able to make technology an essential part of meeting our ambitions for education worldwide. So how can technology help? Well, let's look at some of the ways in which it can make a difference. Why should it improve pedagogy, for example? And here I've listed 5 of the ways in which it can offer different ways of doing pedagogy. First of all, the quality of presentation can be improved because we can now use multimedia features. We can use video, we can use color, we can use animation, and all of those things make a big difference. Accessibility of resources aids inquiry learning, so we don't have to do everything for the student. We can allow the student to research resources which are widely available now on the internet. We can use asynchronous discussion because that actually increases the ratio of student talk to staff talk. If I'm running a tutorial with 10 students for an hour or so in a classroom, the chances are that I will do something like a high proportion of the talking because I'm the tutor, and so the students talk in very short sentences and they tend to ask me questions. That's the focus of the way in which a tutorial runs. When I run the same tutorial online, because it's asynchronous, because the students can spend as much time writing, and when they want to write, as they wish to, then they actually end up saying much more. So I may only be in that process for about an hour altogether. I'm looking at what students have said, I'm responding to what they say, but they're spending a lot more time talking to each other. And that's a very important difference. And then if we look at digital models, or what we might call micro-worlds, virtual worlds. They are ways in which the student can learn about a simulated system. It could be something like a climate change model, for example. And by the system modeling that process, then it's possible for them to investigate it. So it recruits our more natural learning skills, where we're trying to achieve a particular goal. Let's say we're trying to get the global mean temperature of the world to being a certain amount, and I have to manipulate all those different climate parameters. And then I begin to see how I can make it work better. So the way in which we can simulate aspects of the world, whether it's science or it's business or it's economics, means that we can engage students in exploring that world in a very different way. And finally, design tools. We're familiar with the kinds of things that we as teachers can use, using PowerPoint, for example, or presentations, Keynote, Prezi, whatever, those kinds of things that we may happen to use. But all of those things can be used by our students as well. They can use all of those different kinds of design tools, including things like spreadsheets or modeling tools in a variety of different formats. So that enables them to articulate in a different way something that they've learned. They're making something with that design tool. Now let's think of it another way. Why should the student experience improve? And here I want to focus on two things: the benefits which we get from different forms of assessment and the benefits we get from different forms of motivation. Digital assessment is important because it can give immediate personalized feedback. And I don't mean just things like multiple choice questions. If you have a good simulation of a system, for example, the assessment task can be to ask the student to achieve a particular outcome from that model or that system. And that's a very good way of assessing them because they immediately see if they're wrong, if they didn't achieve that outcome. So it's very good at personalized formative assessment. And then for motivation, with digital technologies, you can see immediately how students are much more likely to concentrate, to focus their attention. It's an inviting medium, it's interactive, it's adapting to what you do. So that enables us to focus students' attention much more and motivate them much more highly than we otherwise might. Finally, it's possible to reduce the costs because there are two ways in which we can do this, two principal ways I want to talk about. One is that if you're delivering a lecture like this, for example, you can do that for 20 students or 200 or 2,000. It's the same. It costs the same to deliver that kind of system when you're not located in one particular place, but you're doing it online. So those are fixed costs of the production of teaching, and they can be amortized over a large number of students, and that's one way of improving our cost basis. Secondly, if we're not all the time as tutors having to do the assessment of students, having to offer formative feedback, then we can do that through the technology now and shift more to interactive feedback, which then reduces those variable costs. So we can't take it away completely. I always want to be able to assess my students' essays or look at their project output, but a lot of what they need to be assessed on, they can do in that more formative way. So that kind of benefit can also shift from having to do all of that variable cost help for students and move it into the fixed cost of a system or an interactive testing situation with feedback to the student. So there's many ways in which technology can help this process of being able to work to high quality education, but to much larger numbers. So what it takes to teach with technology is changing. It's increasing teaching workload in a variety of ways, and I've listed several of them here in terms of planning, in terms of curating and adapting all those different kinds of resources, designing activities and resources, creating personalized and adaptive teaching of the kind that I've just talked about, providing flexibility in blended learning options, and then guiding and nurturing large cohorts of students. If we do go online and we do get 200 students instead of 20, that's at some cost. So we have to have other people helping us. We have to engage other tutors in working out how best to support those students. And then using learning technologies to improve both scale and outcomes. That's not something teachers have had to think about before, and that's quite different. And the problem is, institutions and teachers do not typically plan for this. We don't typically plan the teaching workload which is implied by all these new kinds of learning benefits. And we don't typically plan for the need to collaborate if we're going to innovate with technology, because we can't do all of that innovation by ourselves. Every day there's a new technology coming along. So it's very hard for teachers to keep up with that constantly changing technology and respond to what we can all do with it. What this means is that we need to rethink our approach to what it takes to teach. So in a way, what I'm talking about is creating a kind of design cycle for teaching. That cyclical process where if you're trying to do something new, you find out what's already been done. You browse through what's already been done. It's what we do in the context of science and scholarship. We go and read the literature first, and then we take something, we adopt it, and then we use it in some way or create something new, adapt it to our needs. Then we do some kind of self-review and maybe go back to the drawing board and redesign it a bit, and then we'll be ready to test it with students. When we've tested it with students sufficiently, ideally, we'd then publish it so that other teachers could take the benefit of it. And in that way, we would have the means by which collectively, collaboratively, teachers can build teaching community knowledge. We're not all just working in our own little environment, not talking to anyone else, not learning from anyone else. We become much more like scientists in a way. So that in science, we wouldn't dream of starting out by just doing our own thing. We go and read the literature first, and then we find out what other people have done, and we experiment, and then we publish back to the literature, and then other people use what we've done. That's the scientific process. That's how we build knowledge. But in teaching, we don't really do that. So if we think about this then as a design cycle for teaching, it means that we'd be building on other teachers' tested designs. We should be able to make links to existing content resources. We should be able to extract learning analytics from the data that we're collecting because, after all, our students are using technology as they study, so the technology can be recording what they do. And it's possible for us to learn a lot from that testing process with students. And then in publishing, we're contributing what we've learned back to the community, and the whole cycle can start again by other teachers browsing what we've done and learning from that, making use of it, and adapting to their own context. So in a way, it is rather similar to the design cycle for science, where you go round that circle, building on what other people have done, testing it out, and then giving it back to the community. So if we were to ask, what is the teaching design equivalent of the journal paper? What kind of thing would that be? And I want to answer that by taking you through a new kind of online learning design tool that we're developing and show you the kind of thing that we could now do to foster that process of teachers learning collaboratively about how best to use technology. So the Learning Designer is an online tool which gives you access to designs which people have already done, which you're in a position to browse through. You can browse through them in terms of the people who've developed them, or in terms of the kind of topic they address, or the kind of pedagogy that they make use of. In this case, there's a list of inquiry-based learning, collaborative learning, constructionist learning, and discussion-based learning, for example. Or alternatively, you can browse in terms of topic, in terms of computing, or education, or business, or history, whichever topic you might be interested in. Now, suppose you take one of those, you adopt that, and here I've taken one which is about interpreting Tudor portraits. So the design is presented to me in terms of the basic descriptions of how this design is being used in its original context, the topic, the aims, the outcomes, the student numbers, and the total duration of that learning design. What it also does is to show you the details of the pedagogy itself in terms of the types of learning. So for each learning activity, the designer has chosen what kind of learning this is, if it's acquisition or discussion learning, inquiry learning, and so on. It tells you the group size. It tells you whether the teacher is present or not. It might be in a classroom, it might be online, or it might be students working on their own. It attaches the URLs of resources, it tells you the duration of that particular activity, and it provides student guidance in terms of the instructions of what they have to do. So you have quite a complete description of this learning design. And not only that, but it gives you feedback on what kind of learning experience you've created for the student, and it does that dynamically as you build the design. Because the program knows how much of each different kind of learning type you've been creating, because you've told it that. So it's a nice way of seeing overall, have I got a reasonably balanced learning activity here? Or am I doing all the talking, for example? Or have I given them too much working on their own and not enough working through collaboration, and so on? There's no right answer. It doesn't judge you. It just reflects back to you what you've done. So it's an opportunity to develop it. Then you might want to take someone else's design and adapt it to your own purposes. So then there's an editing mode. And in this case, it's on an experimental design for psychology, for example. And the design time here is much more than the time which has actually been allotted. So part of the information that you put in is, I've got 2 hours for this particular learning design, and I'm going to design to it, and it adds up how much time you design. And very often you found you put far too much in. So it's another useful tool for going back to revising your design. Every section of the design, which might have been done by somebody else or by yourself or by a colleague, every section can be edited and new resources attached. So here it's possible to take what someone else has done, which has been used effectively, it's proven to work, and you can contextualize it to what you need for your students. So you're building on something which has already gone before. And then when you have a design which you like and you think might be worth reviewing, then you submit it to the community for them to review. Again, rather like submitting a journal paper. Now here's a nice example of a design that we found was submitted to the Library of Designs in the tool, which was developed in Russian. So I thought you might like to see that particular one, because this is all about ecology. And it's about, the aim of the process is about reducing the amount of plastic use. And this, one of these sections here is where the students have to enter data that they've discovered into a common database, and then they calculate the amount of plastic consumed by a family over a year, and then they discuss the problems and how you might solve it, and in the end they have to come up with an actual solution. So it's a nice design for the problems that we face for dealing with these ecological issues. So that might be the kind of design I find, and I want to adapt it. In this particular case, of course, I have to translate it first, but that's the way that we work in an international learning design community. So again, when we've made that design the design we want, then we can share it and submit it for the review process. So to summarize then, seeing teaching as a design cycle, if we ask the question, what is the teaching design equivalent of a journal paper? Then the answer could be a learning design that can be reviewed, adapted, improved, published, and reused. And in that way, we can build together the learning technology knowledge that we're all going to need. Well, one way to take this a bit further might be to join a MOOC we have coming up on the Coursera platform later in the year, beginning at the end of May. This is something that we've done in collaboration with the UNESCO Institute for IT in Moscow. And there's an international course team. It's based on case studies and experience from more than 30 schools all over the world. It's directed at teachers and head teachers and policymakers in the primary education area. So it's not lifelong learning, but there are some interesting issues in there which are common to all sectors of education. So it would be great if you could join us and see what that course has to offer. So finally, to summarize, the use of effective technologies in higher education and lifelong learning. First of all, we all have a responsibility to meet the global demand for high quality higher education and lifelong learning, and in an affordable way. And my contention is, learning technologies can help both to improve pedagogy and to reduce costs. But understanding the student benefits and the teaching costs is a very complex process. And what it means, I think, is that we have to rethink our approach to what it takes to teach. Most of all, teachers must become a community of learning designers who collaborate to work out the best way to use learning technology. And we've tried to create the technology to do that, and that is what the learning designer is meant to do. It's meant to support that process of building a collaborative community of understanding how to best use learning technology. So please join us to develop this online collaborative learning community. I'll give you the links to the various tools and resources that I've been mentioning. All of this is described in a book called Teaching as a Design Science, and I very much hope that we will be able to have a good question and answer session where you can challenge some of these ideas, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you very much.